Well, welcome. We're so glad you're here, whether you are here in the building or joining us online on video or later in podcast. We are in the middle of a series through the book of John, following Jesus. The main thing, as they said, we keep him above all things. And today, we are picking up right where we left off. Because last week we left off with Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane. And remember, he was praying so earnestly. He was sweating blood as he looked at what was in front of him. And if you were here last week, you remember me saying, it wasn't the cross that disturbed Jesus most. It was something far more sinister. And if you missed last week's teaching, I would encourage you to go find that one on YouTube or our website or podcast. It clarifies a lot of misconceptions about the Old Testament wrath and what Jesus' purpose was here on earth. So make sure you catch last week's sermon. Today we pick up right where we left off. Jesus is there in the garden. He's just finished his praying and earnestly and sweating of blood when suddenly a large number of people approach him. And here in the garden, it would have been the middle of the night, but it was a dark night spiritually, but it was a full moon physically. And so Jesus and the disciples could have seen all who were involved there, how big the group was. Perhaps there's even some identities given as they could see faces and identify people. And so let's jump right into Jesus and the disciples there in the garden, the olive grove in John 18. It says, Judas the betrayer knew this place because Jesus had often gone there with his disciples. The leading priests and Pharisees had given Judas a contingent of Roman soldiers as well as temple guards to accompany him. He has both Roman soldiers and temple guards and chief priests there with him. It's their soldiers, trained people who show up to arrest Jesus. Now with blazing torches, lanterns, and weapons, they arrive at the olive grove. They arrive there with these torches, with weapons, two separate groups of soldiers. There was a detachment with a commander. This was the early hours of the morning. Now let's pause and get some context to this scene. What's going on here? The religious leaders had sent these soldiers to arrest Jesus. And the reality is these religious elites, these priests, they hated Jesus. You see, at the time, Israel was a theocratic nation, at least the people of Israel. They viewed God as their leader. God was central, despite the Roman rule, which meant that the religious priests and elites, they were the political power who could enforce laws and customs, and they held great influence over all the people. Now, there were two main groups of these priests. There was the Pharisees and the Sadducees. And in many different ways, they didn't agree on much. There were some big basics that they did agree on, but they have a lot of differences in opinion. The liberal Sadducees, one thing they didn't believe in the resurrection. And the more conservative Pharisees, they didn't agree with the Sadducees. But they put all their differences aside because they did agree on one thing. This was a bipartisan effort they showed up with that night. They agreed they wanted Jesus removed to get their government and their society, their culture, back on track the way that they wanted it. But why? Why are they opposed to Jesus? I mean, he's without sin. We know that he spent time teaching God's way, God's message. We know that he healed people. He fed them. He loved them. Why would they want Jesus removed? Well, because like a lot of things that get political, they didn't like their power and influence being compromised. They were jealous of Jesus in three ways. First of all, they were jealous of Jesus' power. And not just his divine power of healing and miracles, but that was definitely part of it, but also his power and influence over those that he ministered to. Jesus had already cleared out the temple, which brought in an exorbitant amount of money to the priests that they raked in on these holy holidays. This week especially, the priests, they would gouge the pilgrims who traveled to Jerusalem, selling necessary sacrificial and religious items for 4, 8, and 10 times the amount that they would be sold for. And so if you went there to worship at the temple, you were paying big prices for things that is actually... You knew the worth was much below that. Jesus rebuked this, and he had great power and influence over the people. They also despised his popularity with the people. Jesus was overwhelmingly popular. He had his miracles. I mean, when someone travels to your town and heals and does amazing things that you've seen, you remember that person. That person becomes known in the area. Also because Jesus, he was popular because he was bucking so many of the money-making schemes that what some have called the religious mafia had set up. The people longed to be removed from the burden, the heavy burden that the priests imposed upon them. And add that to the fact, speaking of burden, the priests, they had all these hundreds of laws, religious laws, that they would put on the people. We've talked about this a little bit in the past. Laws so specific, not in the Bible, but the priests made up these laws, like you can only take so many steps on the Sabbath. And so you get halfway home from City Market and you're done. Well, I'm done. And so there's all these nuanced laws that the priest heaped on the people and this religious red tape that Jesus cut right through. And worse than that, people, it said that Jesus ate with sinners. He might have been at a bar with some people who didn't go to church. He might have not gone to Chick-fil-A if he went to Grand Junction. You know what I'm saying? Like Jesus was that kind of Christian. He had a reputation as hanging out with those people. He touched the untouchable. He healed the wounds, even when religion said it shouldn't be allowed today or this way. Jesus claimed that the crux of his teaching was actually easy to understand and the burden was light. In other words, the burden of teaching the priests to put on the people to control them and keep power was so heavy. And Jesus said, "Come to me. My yoke is easy. My burden is light." Love God and love people. Jesus is popular, and among all the throngs and up to millions of people who are pilgrimaging to Jerusalem to see him, they long to see what Jesus is going to do. There's this murmuring as I read through this, will he declare himself Messiah? What's Jesus going to do? Will we see him? He rode in on a donkey. I mean, they're declaring him king. Something's going to happen. And finally, the priests, they hated Jesus because of his politics. He wrestled from them their influence and authority they held politically. He didn't play their political games. He didn't endorse their political agendas. His political statements, he said things like, give to Caesar what is Caesar's and give to God's what is God's. He refused to play their political games, and instead, he was accomplishing purposes that were totally outside of the religious leaders' political agendas. Jesus loved God and loved people without letting earthly politics change that purpose. Jesus loved God and loved people without letting earthly politics get in the way of, taint of, affect that heavenly purpose. He had heavenly purposes above earthly politics. He wasn't a national zealot. He was actually advocating for a heavenly kingdom. He was truly on the politics of heaven, far above the politics of earth. It wasn't that he pushed the politics of earth to the side. It was that his purposes were so much higher. And I am here for heaven's purpose. Jesus lived and preached God above all things. He didn't politic based on rules. He preached based on redemption. He preached relational love over religious law. Some of their political laws, he didn't even pay any mind to, just cut right through it. And some of them he fulfilled without making a big deal of it. They couldn't pin him down. They couldn't figure him out. They couldn't get him to endorse all the right things politically. He wouldn't get on their agenda. He seemed unconcerned with all these earthly religious rules and things they'd made up. He was concerned with something far different, and they couldn't control him. He truly elevated the purposes of heaven above all things on earth. All these factors made it very difficult for the priests. His power, his popularity, and his politics, they were looking for a way to remove Jesus from the scene. Matthew 21, verse 46. They wanted to arrest Jesus, but they were afraid of the crowds. They're afraid of the people, but that's how they are in all things. They're afraid of the crowds who considered Jesus to be sent from God. And unfortunately for the priests, this very week of Passover, the crowds are greater than ever. There is such an influx of people here in the town that if ever they want to do something apart from the people or the crowds, this is not the time. There's people everywhere. Matthew 26, verse 3. Then the chief priests and the elders of the people assembled in the palace of the high priest, whose name was Caiaphas, and they schemed to arrest Jesus, and secretly, and there's no period there. It says, and kill him. They wanted to arrest him secretly and, yes, kill him. Not hold him until this thing blew over. They wanted him out of the picture. And it says they wanted to arrest him secretly, but not during the festival, it says. Not during the festival, they say, or there may be a riot among the people. Like, we have to do this secretly and quietly. If we arrest Jesus in the city, people are going to go crazy. We're going to have riots and rebellion, and we can't have that. So we got to find a way. But how do you remove Jesus during the Passover week if you're trying to do it away from people where there's people everywhere? You see, they've been scheming and planning this for a while, but they have been unable. And in fact, there have been times where they've tried to arrest him, and Jesus simply walked through. They couldn't get their hands on him. They couldn't hold him. So we have to do it secretly, apart from the people. We've got to do this, but how? Everyone's here in town. It was at this point that the unthinkable fell into their laps. And again, we need to put ourselves in the narrative, in the Bible, in the story to really see and to feel the drama of what's happening. Is they want Jesus arrested. They've been doing everything they can, but they have to be careful because of the people. But then something happens that would have delighted them. Matthew 26, verse 14. Then one of the 12, the one called Judas Iscariot, went to the chief priests and he asked them, "What are you willing to give me if I deliver him, Jesus, over to you?" Seemingly out of the blue, someone from Jesus' inner circle approaches. He approaches them. They've been looking for a way, and somebody from the group of 12 who are always with him, approaches them and says, What are you willing to give me? What are you willing to do? Can you imagine their joy? Mark 14:11 tells us they were delighted when they heard why Judas had come. One of Jesus' disciples shows up and, okay, what's this about? And then he offers to turn Jesus over to you in secret, apart from the crowds. They were delighted and they promised to give him money, of course. A person on the inside who can give us access to the access we need to remove Jesus apart from some rebellion and riot in the street. Someone who can deliver Jesus apart from the crowds. We wouldn't have to be in public. We wouldn't be surrounded by people. We could pull this off this very Holy Week with Judas's help, and he just wouldn't show up at the Passover day. No one would be asking, why isn't Jesus declaring that he's Messiah? They'd just be asking, where did he go? Where's he gone? We could do this. Someone can deliver Jesus to us privately. But remember, they don't just want to arrest him. They want him killed. What better time to do it? This moment would have been ecstasy for the priest. As one of Jesus' closest friends and followers is there in their courts bargaining with the life of Jesus. He says, "What are you willing to give me if I deliver him?" And the question he's asking is, what is Jesus worth to you? As humans, we ask that question a lot. What is Jesus worth in my life, in my character? Judas asked us, what is Jesus worth to you? How much would it be worth to the priests if we're able to remove Jesus in secret? How much would it be worth to Judas if he could betray his own rabbi? So they counted out for him 30 pieces of silver. From then on, Judas watched for an opportunity to hand him over. 30 pieces of silver. Now, I had to remove so many pages of this sermon because there are so many prophecies being fulfilled, just line after line after line. And there's a prophecy about the 30 pieces of silver. It fulfills an Old Testament prophecy, but it has a meaning. You see, there is something that has a set value of 30 pieces of silver in their culture. Exodus 21:32 tells us that it's the price of a slave or a servant is 30 pieces of silver. 30 pieces of silver for Judas is no big windfall. Judas agrees to betray the Son of God for the price of a slave. Why such a low price? I do believe that Judas was using Jesus as a means to an end. that Judas, just like the priests and just like many others, have an agenda of their own that they want Jesus to join them in. They want to control Jesus. So Judas, he betrays the kingdom of heaven to further his own kingdom. I believe, and we don't have time for this, I would love to preach on this one, that Judas is perhaps doing this to force Jesus to accomplish political and nationalistic aspirations. That if I force Jesus' hand into the courts, Jesus would rise up and finally declare himself, okay, I'm taking over now. But let's pause for a second and look at Judas. I mean, his actions have made him one of the most reviled people in history. People don't often name their children Judas. Like it's a name loaded with infamy. But how do we get Judas to this decision? We just skip over so much of it and go, oh, Judas. Judas was chosen by Jesus to be a disciple. Jesus didn't make a mistake. He chose Judas. Jesus told Judas, knowing Judas, he says, I know each of you. Judas followed Jesus for 3 years. Think of all the things that Judas witnessed. We see the end here, but just go back through and think of what Judas saw. Not from the crowd perspective, but from right there up close. I mean, he was there. Judas was slack-jawed as he just saw limbs being healed. He saw diseases cured. He saw Jesus reveal his power over natural elements. Judas was in a boat screaming, ah! And he saw Jesus calm the storm. Peace be still. Jesus has power over earthly elements. He was there. He witnessed Jesus walking on water. He passed out bread. Judas was there and had fish and loaves in his hand and kept passing them out 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 until 20,000 were fed. And then he went and collected and he had his own bag of leftovers. Judas was there. He saw that. He witnessed that. He was a part of that. And more than that, he heard each of Jesus' messages. He was sent out along with the other disciples and he cast out demons. He saw Jesus do it, but he got to be a part of it. He saw healings. He watched dead people rise from the grave. He's seen resurrection. Judas has seen and heard the power of God unlike anyone else. There was only 11 other people on the planet who got a perspective that Judas got. But beyond what we just read in here, think of the moments that aren't recorded. Judas there in the inner circle with Jesus. He saw Jesus laugh. He knows what makes Jesus laugh. Judas knows what makes Jesus laugh. Judas has seen Jesus cry. In their culture, being a disciple, the word was talmudin. You didn't want to just be or know what your rabbi knew. You wanted to be like him. And so there's all these stories about how the disciples of rabbis, they would follow their rabbi everywhere, just in case he dropped some nugget of wisdom. They didn't want to miss it. And there's these stories of talmudin disciples just packing into a bathroom as the rabbi was using the bathroom, just in case. I mean, Judas has been there for everything for 3 years. Just hours previous to where we find him here, he sat there and he looked down into the eyes of Jesus as Jesus looked at him, and Jesus washed his feet. We can't forget all that Judas has seen, all that he's felt, that he knew what made Jesus laugh, that he's seen Jesus in a way that we don't get to see Jesus yet. How did Judas come to the point of betraying Jesus? But there's another question. I love, just keep asking questions because they get you somewhere. How did the people around him not notice? Did you ever think of that? Jesus, when he was washing the feet that night, he told his disciples, he said, one of you is going to betray me. Here's what's crazy. When Jesus said that, when he said one of you is going to betray me, they didn't all go, it's Judas. It's Judas. It's Judas. You know what they did? When Jesus said, one of you is going to betray me, they suspected themselves. Surely not me, Lord. There's no finger pointing. Judas leaves that dinner and he goes and gets the priests. But what we see here is that Judas was so adept at hypocrisy that no one suspected him. So he leaves that dinner, gets the priests, gets the soldiers, and he brings them to where Jesus was going. He knows Jesus so well. It says he was familiar with the place. He's familiar with Jesus. He knows that Jesus is leaving the upper room and he'll probably go to the garden. So he brings them there. And there in the garden in Matthew 26:45, then Jesus returned to his disciples. Now Jesus is there. He's been praying. This was last week, praying with blood. And he says, are you still sleeping and resting? Look, the hour has come. You've heard me say over and over throughout this series in the last year, Jesus said, my hour is not yet here. My hour has not yet come. And he says, the hour has come. And the Son of Man is going to be delivered in the hands of sinners. And then look at all the exclamation points. Rise, let us go. Here comes my betrayer. The disciples are waking up and wiping sleep out of their eyes. And Jesus is saying, rise, let us go. Here comes the betrayer. Like there's exclamation. He's waking them up here. But Judas didn't come alone, as we know. While Jesus was still speaking, Judas, one of the 12, arrived. With him was a large crowd armed with swords, armed with clubs, sent from the chief priests and the elders of the people. And here's where we see the ultimate bitter act of betrayal in Mark 14. The traitor Judas had given them a prearranged signal. You will know which one to arrest when I greet him with a kiss. Then he can take him away under guard. And as soon as they arrived, Judas walked up to Jesus and, Rabbi, and gave him a kiss. In their culture, that was an intimate declaration of friendship and closeness. Judas shows his familiarity with Jesus while using that familiarity to his own purposes. If there was ever a loaded kiss on the cheek, it was this one. If there was ever an act of friendship that was solely for personal gain, it was this one. Was Jesus taken off guard? Was he surprised by the people showing up? No. We don't even see him flinch at Judas. The other 11 disciples are still bleary-eyed and shocked. But look at this, John 18. Jesus, knowing all that was going to happen to him, Jesus is not surprised at any of this. Jesus, knowing all that was going to happen to him, went out. He stepped forward to his accusers, and he says, who is it you want? Jesus of Nazareth, they replied. I am he, Jesus said. And Judas the traitor was standing there with them. When Jesus said, I am he, they drew back and fell to the ground. I would encourage you not to use this if you ever get pulled over. Still, it doesn't really work just for, I am he. Here's your ticket. Okay. But what happens here? Something happens here that is pretty amazing. Jesus says, I am he, and the soldiers fall back and fall down. What's so powerful this? Well, if you've been tracking with us, or even last week we talked about when Jesus says, I am, he's using the double Greek. He's saying, ego eimi, I am, I am. It's the name the scholars call the tetragrammatron, which sounds like a transformer, but it's actually the covenant name of God. I am that I am. That's what God declared from the burning bush. And Jesus, they said, we're looking for Jesus of Nazareth. Ego eimi. And at that, they were pushed back and fallen flat on the ground. Divinity says, I am that I am. And humanity collapsed in front of it. Can you imagine? Put yourself in the Bible stories. Put yourself in them. And listen, here's a little clue. Don't always put yourself as Jesus. You know? In this moment, can you imagine being one of those Roman guards that shows up? Like you are trained for battle. You have a sword and you know how to use it. Your army's conquered nations and you have to go arrest a preacher? It's going to be light work tonight, boys. You show up and you have force with you. You've trained people. You're secure in your authority, but also secure in your steel. You're secure in your numbers. There's no crowds. There's no zealots. Just a handful of the holy men in a dark garden with a full moon? Okay. It's going to be pretty easy. You're standing there with your hands on your hilts when suddenly As you're hearing this man talk, he says, ego eimi, and you find yourself pushed backwards and your knees buckle with those two words and you are flat on your face. You find yourself face down in the garden in a posture of supplication. You begin to, this is not how training goes. You begin to pick yourself up. You dust the twigs and you dust the uncertainty off yourself. And as you look around, they're all standing up. Everybody's been pushed down and pushed back. You know authority, you know force, but you don't know what just happened. And there you look, and there is this man, Jesus. He's standing there, standing firm, unbroken, not afraid, not defiant, secure. Suddenly you're the one insecure, despite the numbers and the might. With words you were brought to your face. From this, Peter takes out his sword, and he's just a fisherman, not a sword fighter, so he hits somebody's ear, and Jesus heals it, and Jesus rebukes him, and from there, Jesus is arrested. Jesus is taken into custody. And the disciples, see, they wanted to arrest Jesus away from the crowd so that no one would riot or fight. And as soon as Jesus is taken into custody here, the disciples take off. They flee, fulfilling prophecy. Jesus spoke about this. In fact, in Matthew 26, he just said this in verse 31. Jesus told his disciples, this very night, you will fall away. For it's written in the Old Testament, I will strike the shepherd and the sheep will be scattered. And Matthew 26:55 tells us, then all the disciples deserted him and fled. And that's where we leave it this week. That's where we'll pick up next week at his trial. But I want to pause for a few minutes at the time remaining, and I want to look at some takeaways from the life of Judas, which is a strange thing to think about. What lessons do we learn from Judas? Number one, we learn this. This is very important. That we can hide in our hypocrisy. When Jesus said, one of you will betray me, no one considered Judas. They considered themselves as much as him. Judas reveals that you can be close to Jesus in proximity. You can attend church, you can smile, you can go to growth group, Bible study, you can be in this room and you can shake hands and even do the two-handed, super religious shake, brother. You can do all those, the side hug, all the Christian things we do. And that those things don't mean that your heart is close to Jesus. We can go to activities, we can do good works, and we can act like our hearts are close to God, but no one will actually know in this room just how passionless our faith is. Judas teaches us that we are able to hide in our hypocrisy, that we can be close to Jesus' activity and his functions, but never embrace him and receive him fully in our heart. Judas teaches us you can go to church and not be saved. Because church never gets you to heaven. Christian activity doesn't save us. Judas followed Jesus and did all the activity that Peter and John did. He went out with them. He went out and cast out the demons in Jesus' name and handed out fish and loaves. He clung in that boat, and yet his heart was far from Jesus. Judas reveals that we need a Savior to be saved, that Christian activity is not enough, that good deeds or some star chart in heaven where they give us a star for every time we do something good, that we don't earn our way to heaven through works. We need a Savior. We need a Savior who laid down his life for us so that we can give our life to him. Judas didn't need more Christian activity. Judas needed to surrender his heart to Jesus. And for some of us in this place or listening, it could be that you have been following religious rules and dabbling in Judas Christianity, perhaps thinking that your activity or your proximity to church activity saves you or makes you safe. And Jesus would say, you need a Savior. Your heart needs to draw near to Jesus. For some of you, Orchard, it's not what we need is not more religious activity. It's to finally surrender our hearts and say, Jesus, I give you my heart. Another lesson we learn from Judas is that how you view Jesus makes all the difference in the world. Judas gives us clues to how he sees Jesus. In Matthew 26, we've talked about this when Jesus tells them, one of you will betray me. In verse 22, being deeply grieved at this, the disciples began to say to him, surely not me, Lord. Surely not me, Lord. They were deeply grieved. And the word used here is kurios, Lord, Messiah. Surely not me, Messiah. Jesus, Lord, Messiah. Surely not me. 3 verses later, Judas asked the same question. Surely you don't mean me, Master. The word used here is a different word. It's a word that means more teacher or master. And the difference those two words make, the nuances there can speak volumes. The disciples were deeply grieved, and they said, Lord, Messiah, surely not me, deeply grieved. And Judas asks separately, teacher, master, surely not me. Following Jesus as Messiah is vastly different than following Jesus as master. In a saving relationship with Jesus, he is your Messiah. In religion, you have a master. See, we obey a Messiah out of love. We obey a master out of fear. We follow a Messiah out of conviction, and we follow a master out of compulsion. I ought to, or I ought not, instead of conviction and love. You come to a Messiah empty-handed, desiring him to do in you what you cannot do for yourself, but you come to your master with hands full of good works, hoping he's happy with you. You follow a Messiah out of a heart's devotion, but you follow a master out of heartless duty. Which makes us we need to pause and ask these questions of ourselves. Is Jesus my Messiah, or is he more of a master? Am I following him out of love and gratitude? Or am I following some sort of religious duty with the fear that if I don't do the right thing and if I do the wrong thing, he's somehow going to remove his protection and not bless me? You see, a disciple who follows Jesus, a Messiah, has love as their primary motivator. But a disciple who follows a master has fear as their primary motivator. Don't displease God. Don't displease the master like there's some cosmic master in the sky, the big guy who stands up there with his arms crossed and he wears a frown. And I just want to ask, when it comes to God, when you think of how God sees you, does he wear a frown or a smile? How do you view God viewing you? See, the truth is we have a God in heaven who loves us. And we have a Savior, a Messiah, who stands not with arms crossed, but with arms open of forgiveness and redemption calling you. We need to ask ourselves, do I follow Jesus the Messiah out of my heart? Or am I more following a master as a part of a religion, going through religious activity that I feel no passion about? My faith is never stretched. This isn't like just a, master or Messiah. Well, of course it's Messiah, preacher. The fruit of our lives will tell us more than we know about how we actually see Jesus. And this isn't just a question to gloss over. This is the question. This is the difference between a John disciple and a Judas disciple. And the final lesson we learn from Judas has everything to do, yes, with how he viewed Jesus and how it affected his view of other things, especially worship. This was earlier in John 12. Jesus has just raised Lazarus from the grave. And Mary is in such gratitude and such thanksgiving and in such awe and in such a state of worship, she comes to Jesus and she pours out perfume on his feet. This is no regular foot washing. This is an act of worship. But not everybody was so pleased. We read this in John 12. Mary took a 12-ounce jar of expensive perfume. It was made of the essence of nard, and she anointed Jesus' feet with it, wiping his feet with her hair. The entire house was filled with the fragrance. The whole house is filled with the aroma of her worship of the Messiah. He has done a great thing, but more than just what he's done, it's who he is. He's Jesus. He's worthy, and I will pour out my life. I will pour out my heart. I will pour out my resources, even the costliest possession I have. Now, what was meant to be dabbed here and there and reserved for and rationed for occasion, Mary just pulls the top out and begins to anoint and pour out on his feet. She poured it out in worship, but not everybody was impressed. But Judas Iscariot, it says, the disciple who would soon betray him, he said this, "That perfume is worth a year's wages. It should have been sold and the money given to the poor." Now, hold on. That seems like a very wise decision, he's saying there. Why pour out a bunch of perfume on Jesus' feet? We could sell it and help the little kids. The kids. No one's thinking of the kids except for Judas. Well, we learn here, it says in verse 6, not that he cared for the poor. He was a thief, and he was in charge of the disciples' money, and he often stole for himself. Again, he's hiding in his hypocrisy. He's hiding his hypocrisy by saying, what about the kids? What about the poor? And here's where we draw out a very important principle from the life of Judas. Judas viewed worship as waste. He viewed worship as waste. What was poured out at the feet of Jesus in worship, he considered a waste. A waste of energy, a waste of resources, a waste of money, a waste of effort. Oh, he claimed it was for noble reasons, but John tells us otherwise. Judas viewed worship as waste. Why would someone go to such great lengths and waste so much stuff for Jesus? It has everything to do with how he viewed Jesus and viewed other people. When in Mary's heart, Jesus was worth everything. He was worth her perfume. He was worth her resources, her energy, her time, her talents. Jesus was worth her whole life. She poured it out in thanksgiving and worship because of who he was. Orchard, we can dabble in Judas Christianity when we begin to see worship as a waste. When we begin to look at how other people are worshiping and go, oh, that's not how it's done. That's not how it's done. That's what Judas did. He saw worship being poured out and he goes, no, that's not how it's done. We dabble in Judas Christianity when we begin to view worship as a waste. And I know, let's just be honest. We each come in this room, or if you're joining us online, we each come to this with our own experiences and backgrounds. You come from whatever background you have, and you have a certain preference of worship, and the person across from you has a completely different background and has never been to that kind of service. We come into this room with this many different backgrounds and experiences, and it comes with preferences of worship. And that's like saying, well, I wish her perfume was a little more flowery. I wish she would pour out a little more, maybe a sandalwood would be nice. That's what we do when we begin to judge based on our preferences. Worship, when worship is not for us. Worship has nothing to do with the perfume. It's about the heart of Mary. We need to begin to see that worship is not a waste, and our preferences do not speak to how it should or should not be done. The higher concern is the one it's done for. Who are we worshiping, and is he worthy? Which means, in our praise music, guess what? It's not about the song. And I know there's some songs that, ooh, I like that one. It gets me there. But here's the challenge, and we used to do this. We used to put on just some old cheesy 80s worship and try to worship to it, because God is still worthy, regardless of what the perfume smells like. It's not about the music. It's not about the song. It's not about the volume. It's not about the band. It's solely and fully about Jesus Christ and who he is. Worship is for someone, and it's not us. Jesus poured out his blood and his life to do a great work for us. And in us, Orchard, may we be the people who we pour out our worship extravagantly. May we pour our worship in such a way that people go, that's a waste. Okay. Like David said, I'll become even more undignified, but don't take off your clothes if you know the story. Leave them on. Here's the deal. And here's what we're going to do. We're going to sing 2 songs to finish this up. One is a praise song. It might be new. You might not know the words. It might have those drums in it. I don't know. It might not be your preference. The other side is it might be your preference. What we're going to learn today is who worship is for. It is for Jesus. And we are not to judge. Worship is waste. My hope is that in this place, there is a pleasing aroma of worship that fills the house. So we're going to sing a praise song and we're going to sing a hymn. And each of you is already excited about one of them. Let's let our preferences diminish and let our worship become extravagant. And the Bible talks on and on and on about raising of holy hands. See, we think some denomination or some TV preacher invented that, and that's what they do. That's all throughout the Old Testament. Maybe today, for the first time, you lift a hand. Oh, that's too much. Maybe you just lift just a pinky. Not too high, however it is. The point is that in this, we lift our hearts. And we don't look at others and go, that's not how I would do it. That's okay. Jesus is worthy. Here's your assignment. Stand to your feet, Orchard. Stand to your feet. We're going to sing 2 songs, and I want this place to be filled with the aroma of praise. And it is not based upon us and our preferences or the band and the song. Orchard, we need to remember, we sing and we praise and we worship a God, a Messiah who is worthy. So I want to hear your hearts poured out. Jesus Christ, we come before you. Father, we don't have perfume on this day, but we pour out our hearts, we pour out our words, we're going to sing to you. I pray that in this time, maybe for the first time, you would help some of us experience what worship truly is. That it is solely about you. We look past our preference, past the song and the volume, the whatever. It is you and you alone. So Jesus, hear your Orchard, hear your people as we declare Jesus Christ worthy of worship.